It was not fought in a single day, nor decided by one climactic clash. No great battlefield marks its location. And yet, it was the longest, most relentless campaign of the Second World War, a 6-year struggle, waged across 100 million square kilometers of open ocean. A war not just of men, but of machines, frequencies, and shadows beneath the waves. In 1941, Britain teetered on the edge of starvation. German U-boats were sinking Allied ships by the hundreds, and the Atlantic, Britain's lifeline, was bleeding. The Royal Navy could not protect every convoy, every merchant, every sailor. There simply weren't enough ships, enough planes, or enough time. Victory in Europe could not be imagined unless the Atlantic could first be secured. And yet, by 1943, something extraordinary happened. The predator became the prey. The Kriegsmarine's feared U-boat arm was thrown back by a technological and tactical revolution the world had never seen before. From sonar and depth charges to Enigma decrypts and long-range liberators, the tide had turned. So how did the Allies pull off one of the most remarkable strategic turnarounds of the war? The Battle of the Atlantic began not with a bang, but with a torpedo. On September 3, 1939, just hours after Britain declared war on Nazi Germany, a German submarine sank the SS Athenia, a British passenger liner. It was a quiet yet symbolic opening shot in a war that would come to define the Atlantic Ocean as one of the world's deadliest theaters. For Germany, the strategy was clear. Britain was an island nation. It imported the majority of its food, fuel, and raw materials by sea. Cut the lifeline, and you could strangle the empire without ever landing on its shores. The Kriegsmarine Germany's navy had limited surface strength compared to the Royal Navy, but its underwater arm, the U-Bootwaffe, was far more dangerous. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of Germany's U-boats, envisioned a war of attrition: starve the British, sink the tonnage. One torpedoed merchant ship could deliver more damage to Britain's war economy than a dozen bombs dropped on London. By early 1941, the numbers were staggering. British and Allied shipyards were producing around 1.5 million tons of merchant shipping per year. But losses, if they continued at the current rate, were set to exceed 7 million tons. Britain could lose a quarter of its merchant fleet within a year. If the U-boats prevailed, Britain would fall without a single German soldier setting foot on its soil. During this early phase, U-boats enjoyed what their crews later called the first happy time. With France defeated in 1940, German submarines now had direct access to Atlantic ports along the French coastline. From bases at Lorient, Brest, and La Rochelle, they could patrol the shipping lanes with far greater range and endurance. British convoys, stretching in thin lines across the vastness of the ocean, were easy targets. There were too few escorts, too little coordination, and no air cover in the central Atlantic. Convoy HX-79, for example, sailing from Halifax to Liverpool in October 1940, lost 12 ships to a single wolfpack of German submarines. A few months later, Convoy SC-7 lost 20 ships, and this was only the beginning. To counter the U-boat menace, the Royal Navy turned to a century-old tactic: the convoy system. By grouping merchant ships together and assigning them escorts, destroyers, corvettes, armed trawlers, they hoped to protect more ships with fewer resources. But the escorts were often undertrained, under-equipped, and lacked the technology needed to locate a submerged enemy in time. The key gap was underwater detection. Enter ASDIC, an early sonar system using sound waves to detect submarines. Developed between the wars, ASDIC allowed ships to ping the ocean and detect hidden U-boats, but only when they were submerged. And therein lay the flaw. Most U-boat attacks occurred on the surface at night, when ASDIC was useless. Still, ASDIC was a start. The Royal Navy paired it with depth charges barrels of high explosives set to detonate at certain depths. In theory, they could destroy or damage a submarine once it was located. In practice, success depended on guesswork, skill, and luck. Too often, ships would chase a phantom echo while the real U-boat slipped away, torpedoes reloaded. By early 1941, Churchill himself recognized the strategic catastrophe unfolding at sea. He formed the Battle of the Atlantic Committee and Emergency War Cabinet, tasked with halting the losses. "The only thing that ever really frightened me during the war," Churchill later wrote, "was the U-boat peril." Deep analysis, wolfpacks, technology, and the Black Pit. The U-boat arm was not just a collection of submarines, it was an organized, coordinated fleet connected by radio and guided by Enigma, the famous German cipher machine. U-boat captains received coded instructions from headquarters in Lorient, allowing them to assemble into wolfpacks, groups of submarines that could strike in concert against a convoy, overwhelming its escorts and sinking ship after ship in a matter of hours. The Kriegsmarine's encrypted messages were considered unbreakable. The Enigma machines used a complex system of rotors and plugboards that changed the cipher daily. Even if the Allies intercepted the message, decoding it in time was thought to be impossible. But this was a fatal assumption. By late 1941, thanks to the work of Polish mathematicians and British cryptanalysts at Bletchley Park, most notably Alan Turing, the Allies were making critical progress in breaking Enigma. Early breakthroughs allowed British intelligence to anticipate U-boat movements, redirect convoys, and organize counterattacks. But decryption delays meant that many messages were still being decoded after attacks had already occurred. Full strategic advantage would take time. Meanwhile, the Germans opened the Second Happy Time in 1942. With the United States now in the war but still woefully unprepared for submarine warfare, German U-boats patrolled the eastern seaboard of North America almost unopposed. The U.S. Navy, underestimating the U-boat threat, failed to implement blackouts or convoy systems early on. The result was catastrophic. Between January and August 1942, U-boats sank over 3 million tons of Allied shipping. The waters from New York to the Gulf of Mexico became a killing ground. At night, city lights silhouetted merchant ships against the skyline, making them easy targets. German commanders joked they could read newspapers by the glow of burning tankers. But beneath the despair, the tide was turning. The Allies were learning quickly. Aircraft were the key. Long-range patrol planes like the British Sunderland, the American Consolidated Catalina, and later the Liberator, closed the Black Pit, a vast mid-Atlantic gap where convoys previously had no air cover. Radar-equipped aircraft could now detect surface submarines even at night. Some carried depth charges. Others were coordinated with nearby escorts. The days when a U-boat could attack with impunity were ending. And then came the weapons. The Hedgehog, a forward-throwing mortar, could launch dozens of explosive projectiles in a spread, dramatically increasing the chance of a direct hit. Its successor, the Squid, was even more accurate. These weapons didn't just harass submarines, they killed them. German innovations, such as the snorkel, radar-absorbing coatings, and decoy devices like Bold, delayed the inevitable, but they couldn't reverse it. The Allies had cracked the code literally and tactically. By May 1943, the climax arrived. In May 1943, the hunters became the hunted. The technological race that had defined the Battle of the Atlantic was over, and the Allies had won it. It was not just a matter of better weapons or newer ships. It was the comprehensive integration of air, sea, and intelligence power. The Royal Navy and the U.S. Navy flooded the Atlantic with escort groups, each bristling with radar, sonar, Hedgehog projectors, and depth charges. Convoys were now defended not only by destroyers and corvettes, but by escort carriers floating airfields that extended aerial coverage deep into the ocean. From late 1943 onward, the Atlantic was no longer a hunting ground. It was a death trap for submarines. The U.S. shipbuilding industry, turbocharged by wartime mobilization, began launching Liberty ships at a staggering pace, more than one per day at the height of production. Each one was a direct rebuttal to Germany's sinking statistics. Even at their most effective, U-boats could no longer sink ships faster than America could build them. On land, Bletchley Park continued breaking Enigma messages at an accelerating pace. Ultra-intelligence provided convoy routes, U-boat deployment patterns, and even internal assessments from German Naval Command. The Allies were not just reacting to U-boat threats, they were preempting them. In Germany, despair crept into the ranks of the once elite U-boat crews. Submarine warfare had devolved into a suicide mission. New recruits, often younger and less experienced, entered service knowing that their chances of survival were slim. Letters from home painted a bleak picture. Morale plummeted. Faith in Dönitz's strategy wavered. Even Hitler, who once praised the U-boat as the sword of German vengeance, began to lose interest. Meanwhile, the Atlantic lifeline remained unbroken. The sea lanes between North America and Britain delivered not only food and fuel, but the men and machines that would cross the English Channel in June 1944 and begin the liberation of Europe. It is no exaggeration to say that the Battle of the Atlantic was a prelude to day. Without the supply convoys, the buildup of forces in Britain, the coordination between Allied commands known of it would have been possible. That month alone, German U-boats lost 41 submarines in the Atlantic, their worst losses in any month of the war. For Admiral Dönitz, who had by then replaced Admiral Raeder as Commander-in-Chief of the Kriegsmarine, the reality was undeniable. His once dominant force was being decimated faster than it could be rebuilt, and these losses weren't isolated mishaps, they were systemic. Every new convoy was more heavily defended, every new Allied tactic more precise, and every returning U-boat more rattled than the last. Dönitz had bet everything on U-boats, believing they could turn the tide of the war. He had once said, "The U-boat alone cannot win the war, but it can bring Britain to its knees." Now, his submariners were dying at unprecedented rates. Nearly 3 out of every 5 U-boat crewmen who went to sea would never return. It was no longer a battle of attrition, it was annihilation. On May 24, 1943, after weeks of unbearable losses, Dönitz made the fateful decision to pull his submarines out of the North Atlantic. The wolfpacks were recalled. It was the beginning of the end for the German U-boat arm as an effective, offensive force. Though U-boats would return to the Atlantic in smaller numbers, their capacity to tip the strategic balance was gone. The Allies now had control of the sea. By the end of the Second World War, more than 36,000 Allied sailors, 30,000 merchant seamen, and over 70,000 civilians had died in the Battle of the Atlantic. Germany lost over 750 U-boats and nearly 30,000 U-boat crew, more than 75% of all submariners who served. It was the costliest naval campaign in history. Yet it was also among the most decisive. It ensured that Britain stayed in the war. It enabled the United States to become the arsenal of democracy. And it marked the end of Germany's ability to project strategic force across the oceans. But perhaps most importantly, it showed that modern warfare would not be won by courage alone. It would be won by codebreakers and engineers, radar operators and production lines, by networks of strategy and science that turned the tide of battle before a single torpedo was launched. The legacy of the Battle of the Atlantic lives on in the vast sonar nets beneath the modern seas, in NATO's integrated maritime strategy, and in the simple yet hard-earned lesson that oceans are not voids, they are battlegrounds. Today, across the floor of the Atlantic, hundreds of rusted hulls lie silently beneath the waves' graveyards of steel where the war never ended. Some still carry their crews, lost forever in the cold dark. The sonar pings have long since faded, the Enigma machines fallen silent, but the question remains. How close did the Allies come to losing the Atlantic? And had the wolfpacks not been stopped, had the Enigma code not been broken, had the liberators not arrived in time, what would Europe, what would the world look like today? That is a question we may never fully answer. But it is a reminder that some of the greatest battles in history were not fought on land, but in the silence beneath the sea. If this episode gave you a new perspective on the war beneath the waves, consider subscribing to Legacy Files, where we explore the turning points that shaped our world, one story at a time.